Good. Well, welcome everyone. Good morning. My name is Conrad Holden. I am the chief editor of Laser Focus World, which you probably don't know anything about, but it's a technology magazine. It's focused. It's been around 50 years. We obviously focus on lasers, optics, imaging, fiber optics. So anything related to light-based technologies or photonics is a general term for it. So our topic today is quantum computers, and specifically a young company started here at Yale that has the potential to have a major impact on a world that's clearly racing to build a quantum computer. I wanted to tell you a little bit of the background in that there's a massive investments going on around the world right now in quantum technology. I mean, in Europe, there's a 1 billion euro quantum flagship program. And this is, of course, aimed not just at quantum computers, but quantum communications and also quantum sensors. And also, well, in Europe, Germany, Britain, the Netherlands, they all have very individual, strong national programs. China, there's billions going into universities from the government, and they're focused on communications and computing. And in the US, there's increasing pressure on the federal government to create something called the National Quantum Initiative. You'll hear more about it. I think it's sort of now being presented to subcommittees and committees in Congress. They're asking for, depends how you read it, over $1 billion between commercially oriented quantum technologies and defense-oriented, which is actually $700 million of that. The Defense Department is requesting over a 5-year period. And of course, in terms of quantum computers, IBM, Intel, Microsoft, Google in the US are all have big and very publicized programs on it. In China, Alibaba and other companies are also investing extensively in quantum computing. And if you do a little Googling around, you'll see that there are some websites listing all the quantum computers startups supposedly in the country, in the US, and there are quite a few. So there really is a race, and they're all aiming toward what's some term the quantum supremacy, which I don't think researchers really like the term. But anyway, that's often a term you'll hear. And so we're here today to talk about a Yale startup, Quantum Circuits Incorporated, or QCI. And we've got Robert Shulkoff, who is a Sterling Professor of Applied Physics at Yale, and he's the director of the Yale Quantum Institute, and he's also the co-founder and the CEO of QCI. And we also have, to my immediate right, Brendan Dixon, who is a partner at Canaan Partners, and it's a venture capital company. It's based in Westport, and they have invested very nicely into QCI. So this conversation will last about that's the spirit. This conversation will last now about 35 minutes, I think. So, and about halfway through it, I'm going to turn to the audience and ask for your questions. You'll find in your desks, there's a microphone in front of all the way around at each desk. And if you want to speak and use the microphone, just press the button and the mic will be on. Acoustics may be good enough otherwise. But. So I'm going to start with you, Rob. What is it? What is a quantum computer? And can you give us some example of what a quantum computer can do that a regular computer can't? And that's sort of a basic place we'll start.
Gee, I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah.
Okay. So quantum computing is a completely different approach for how we could store and process information. So the basic idea is you replace the zeros and ones, the bits in an ordinary computer, with some quantum device or object that would have two states, and those could represent the 0 and 1. Mm-hmm. But the point is the quantum world really works in a very different way than all the classical things we have intuition for that we see around us in the world, and in a very different way than even modern microprocessors work. So a quantum bit or qubit that's representing our information can first of all be placed in something that physicists call a superposition, which is a little bit like being simultaneously in both the 0 and the 1 state. And if you have an array of these quantum bits, then you can actually program them to be manipulated in a certain way. They will become what we call entangled with one another, which means they have very interesting kinds of non-classical effects, non-classical correlations. In terms of computing, what it means is that the quantum computer can sample very large possible space of permutations. Essentially, a quantum register inside one of our computers can simultaneously be exploring all of the classically allowable states from all zeros to all ones and everything in between. And what we've understood mathematically now for a couple of decades is that there are some kinds of computing problems for which this will be uniquely enabling. It'll allow us to actually calculate and compute things that would otherwise be forever impossible.
Okay, in a nutshell.
Yeah.
So what does the term quantum supremacy mean?
Because of this special properties that a quantum computer has, it scales in a very different way. So the equivalent classical or conventional computing power of a quantum computer basically doubles for each bit, each quantum bit you would add to the machine. Okay, so for even around 30 to 50 quantum bits worth of information or computing, you now have a set of possibilities that you can work with which are so large they could never be held even on a conventional computer. And so this term quantum supremacy was originally invoked to mean, okay, when we have a quantum computer that will be doing computations you would otherwise never do. But in the near term, basically just getting to that scale of early stage quantum machines means that we'll be exploring some of this amazing computing power and complexity.
Okay, so a little bit of background about QCI. How did you get on this path? I mean, to a startup company.
Yeah, well, so I've been here at Yale for 20 years on the faculty, and for me and for my colleagues here, it started as a very fundamental science question, a curiosity-based thing. We knew that this idea of quantum computing was there, and the questions we were asking were, could we ever make sort of man-made objects that would behave this way? Could we build even a single quantum bit? And the research has made incredible progress over the years to the point where, a few years ago, we could see that we were really going to be able to build useful systems out of them.
And what led you to decide to start a company based on that?
Well, again, I think this field, right now there's still a lot of science going on. A question I get asked a lot is, is this science still or is it engineering? And this is actually a thing that venture capitalists want to know. Is it ready for these kinds of investments, right?
It is, right?
Yes.
Cool.
Right, and so, but I mean, a lot of people, I think, when they ask me this question, they want a sort of one-bit answer, to make a little bit of a joke, right? So they want a yes or a no. Right. And my retort is usually like, well, tell me when the science of semiconductor devices stopped. Okay, it never did, right? It's just that at some point you were not only doing research out of Bell Labs to discover the transistor, but you were starting to have a Fairchild and an Intel, and they can do things that aren't appropriate for and are beyond what a university and a bunch of graduate students and postdocs and professors like me can do. Okay. So it's to really, as we saw that there was both a need for systems engineering to take things to the next level and the potential to actually make a real impact on the world, was when my co-founders and I started really thinking about how we would launch a company to do this.
Well, then I'll just segue to you, Brendan. And basically, for those in the audience who maybe don't know exactly what a venture capital financing company does, just a little background.
Sure. So I'm a partner at Canaan Partners. Canaan's an early stage venture capital firm. We manage roughly $3 billion. We are investing our 11th fund, and we focus on early stage. So essentially seed or Series A, the first or second institutional financing of a company. And we focus on things that are tech or life sciences related, and things that we believe have the potential to scale up dramatically, right? So the venture capital, the venture capital model is predicated on, for 10 investments you make, a number of them won't work, but a handful, hopefully, will become massive companies, and they will pay for the losses in the portfolio, right? So the things that we bet on, we want to bet on things that could be very big. So we were seed investors in a consumer-facing company called Instacart. We were Series A investors in a financing company called Lending Club. We early investors in a company called Skybox, which puts small-size satellites up in space. And so what we're looking for always is technologies or ideas that have the ability to be very, very large businesses as they scale. And so quantum computing fits, I think, quite clearly in that if you define a future mode of computation, you are sort of almost by definition going to be building a very big and important company in the process.
So we can safely assume that you don't have any other investments in quantum computing companies, right?
No, we don't have any other investments. We, generally VCs try to avoid investing in competing companies. We've spoken to a lot of quantum computing companies over the course of the past couple of years, which as part of gave us insight when we decided to invest in QCI.
So this is at the very edge of science and engineering, clearly. So how do you think about it? I mean, you're obviously not just going to trust him. You have to understand enough to make a
so there's two things here. I mean, you go out and read blogs or whatever. VCs always say it's about big spaces and high quality teams. And so Rob is probably a little modest, and the rest of the Yale Quantum Institute faculty is probably a little modest. But if you don't know, Yale is the leading research institution in the U.S. Right? There's something that maybe we'll come to later. You've all heard of Moore's law in computing. There's something that quantum researchers call Sholkoff's law. A number of people have adopted the approach that was pioneered at Yale across the entire Yale research faculty. When you, as a venture investor, looking at who do you invest in phenomenal teams first. And so an opportunity to partner with the Yale lab is an incredibly attractive thing. And then we do work, right? We, in the process of diligencing this, we've spoken to all of the other startups in the space. We spoke to people at the large incumbents. We spoke to researchers across academia to get perspective. There's a very common belief and thread that it is time for this technology to move into commercialization. There's always, as Rob said, there's always science to continue to be done. But at the same time, we're past the pure academic piece of it.
And I think you have some background in computer science, and so did that help?
It helped. So I have a master's degree in computer science that I spent most of my time working in robotics. I took one non-credit class on quantum computing in that period of time. It helped. Yeah. I don't, please don't ask me to go up there and explain the waveform or the benefits and strengths of all the various approaches. But I'm also not scared in terms of diving into these things and having those conversations.
Okay. And so, Rob, maybe I'll go back to you just a little bit. Could you explain what role the Yale itself played or the Office of Cooperative Research? What did they play in helping you or working with you?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said before, it's been a long road to get to this point, and many successes along the way. But we had a lot of support and investment from the university and from our government funding agents over this time to do the science and so on. And then, the Yale OCR was extremely helpful and supportive for us. First in sort of figuring out how we would begin developing a patent portfolio in the space, and then helping us figure out how to license that over to QCI. And I think, we appreciate very much having the ability to work with them. And, again, kind of because of my comment about not just being science or engineering, what we're trying to put together here in New Haven, and I think we've got a really nice model for now, is something where we combine the strengths of academia and the private sector. So we're continuing to push the science forward, because saying that you maybe know how to build a thing is not the same thing as saying the best or the fastest way to do something. And at the same time, we have to have some successes. We have to have the work on translating this technology over into the private sector. So, being flexible and putting together the right model is really important.
Okay, so you got the aid then. So can you talk a little bit about the business model for quantum, and then maybe how you looked at that when you heard it?
Yeah, I mean, so at the risk of giving you a disappointing answer, the belief is very much. So let me take a step back. So at Canaan, we do a lot of life sciences and we do a lot of tech investing. And the life sciences, one of my colleagues is moderating the panel in the other room right now. We've invested in a number of companies coming out of Yale. We've partnered with Yale a number of times. Right, and those are things, there's a pretty, you know how you're going to commercialize those in time once you get past a series of gates in terms of, in that world, FDA testing, right? Or clinical trials, I should say. Here, the way that we sort of know at the end state how the likelihood for these things to be delivered is, right? It's going to be delivered somehow via the cloud, where you will either send in a query or something to that matter. Just for context, right, the approach that QCI is taking involves, massive dilution refrigerators. Rob just did a 24-hour trip to Helsinki to look at the ones that QCI is buying that chill things down to, with a fraction of absolute zero. You're not going to have one in your car, right? You're not going to have one on your cell phone. These are going to have to be accessed remotely. But at the same time, as we think about it, right, again, if you invent the next way of computing, you are going to have an incredibly valuable company, sort of regardless of how you choose to deliver that to the end user.
Yeah. So the cloud is basically what we're talking about as a business model.
I think
general terms.
There's a general trend in computing today, which is there is a kind of rollover in Moore's law, and there's a lot of development now going on into sort of special purpose hardware for computing, both in machine intelligence and other kinds of things, using conventional computing devices like FPGAs or GPUs. Quantum computing could be like another wave of that. It's a different way of programming, it's a different way of solving your problems, and you need special purpose hardware for that. But if you can unlock some functionality, some use cases that would otherwise be blocked for you or give people a real competitive advantage, then they would potentially sign up to do that. So, think of it as a new potential wave in high-performance computing. You may say, that sounds kind of dry. I don't really understand why high-performance computing is good. But if you did an internet search to find the address on your way over here, you used a tiny slice of a high-performance computer that was somewhere off in the internet, right? So, we could offer that for different kinds of functions.
Okay. So, how do you staff a company like that? I mean, what's the workforce situation? You're right at Yale, so presumably you have a lot of access to, people could be in the field, but
Right. I think again we see supporting roles for the different organizations. So we're continuing to get all the best minds in the world to come to Yale to study with us and to train with us at the Quantum Institute and in the Applied Physics Department. At QCI, what we really need is the things we can't get. So we have a core of physicists who really understand the technology, but really at QCI, the idea is to bring in computer scientists, electrical engineers, RF and microwave engineers, mechanical engineers even, who can apply some of the capabilities of those other disciplines to make the systems more practical, more robust, and to accelerate their development. And so the challenge really is finding, smart but flexible people and bringing them together to get the synergy between all the disciplines while keeping the focus on the big goal. So what we see, you mentioned a lot of the big corporate players who are in this. What we see is they're mostly hiring our graduates and trying to learn themselves what the science is about. And I think, with a small startup, we can be much more nimble and we're much more focused on the goal. And, I think this area is so interesting right now that we're getting, incredibly experienced and talented, very interesting people to come in and work with us. And I'm learning a ton about all sorts of other things, I had to know a bit about software and programming because we had to get to this stage, but learning how software is really developed, this is a fascinating thing that we're... encountering now.
I know that the workforce development is a big deal it's a big concern at a national level. I mean, you've got a real access to people, attracting people. So you're not hitting a wall in terms of attracting talent, but do you see that it's an issue in a larger sense?
I mean, it is. I think this is one of the motivating factors for continuing governmental support of this, right? And this National Quantum Initiative. You have to basically train quantum engineers or something. We're in the process. I mean, already during the time at Yale, we had to create a new discipline that was this hybrid of computer science and electrical engineering and quantum physics. And an interesting question, which is also being thought about here at the university, is how do we actually tailor educational programs toward that? So, rather than having them need to do a 6-year PhD in my lab, can you take an engineer and retrain them to work in this area? What are the essential things they would need to know to contribute? Right. So this is all kind of interesting stuff that will need to evolve as this industry launches.
Well, as we discussed earlier, you yourself had worked for a while at NASA, Goddard. Mm-hmm. I mean, was that a big helpful aspect?
Yeah, I guess I maybe had a little bit more of an applied bent growing up as a physicist. So I worked for a couple years as an engineer at NASA, and in my PhD, I was in a group really doing radio astronomy and developing the sensors, the detectors, and the devices. And actually, when I first came here to Yale as a postdoc in applied physics, I was working with a faculty member here, Dan Prober, who was doing that same kind of work. So I think, I've always sort of understood the need for the synergies between engineering and science.
So that's a good path.
Yeah.
I mean, a helpful path anyway.
It was not exactly planned, but worked out nicely.
Right. So I was going to open the floor to the audience a bit.
Given that the big challenge... Okay. Given that the big challenge in quantum computing is measurement and decoherence from the environment, I'm curious what you think about the possibility that the secret lies in biological systems. I know there's some cases from quantum biology where the system itself provides frequencies that allow for continued coherence of quantum particles in spite of the warm environment. Is that a possibility that is emerging?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that are interesting in your question there. So, I mean, indeed, the biggest challenge for the field of quantum computing is to be able to scale up our computational power, have more of these quantum bits, and to have the computation run successfully all the way to the end. And this decoherence you mentioned is the fact that quantum bits tend to forget, and they've improved dramatically over the years. That's this Sholkov's law. The performance of these superconducting qubits has improved 1 millionfold in the 15 years we've been sort of working on them. I'm not really sure of how biological systems or techniques could improve our hardware, which is running, as Brendan said, near absolute zero. One of the interesting use cases of quantum computing, though, might be helping you to design new biological molecules or things like that, where being able to actually address the root quantum mechanics of that problem is pretty hard on a conventional computer. So.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Where do you see the bottleneck, if there's one, at this point, and making a shift?
Was there just one?
I guess it's not really clear to me, and that this is still going to be a hard problem to crack, and it's a fairly long time frame thing, and that's why we need the right kind of investors who are used to doing early stage tech. I think one of the things we're doing in this early phase is really just figuring out how to properly engineer these systems. And I don't think we see any bottlenecks. I think there are areas we know we'll need to target resources and more engineering development at, and exactly how we should divide our efforts is one of the things that everyone in the field needs to kind of suss out.
So I'll answer in a slightly different tact, which is one of the challenges in the field, and one of the reasons, maybe something that's interesting. One of the reasons that we chose to invest in the team here, outside of knowing that there's a whole bunch of other people that are going after the market, is one of the challenges that the industry will have, given the approach that's being taken, is how you scale up, right? And this comes down, without going too deep into the weeds, and reminder, I'm not a PhD in physics, is error correction, right? You do a calculation on a computer, how do you know that you got the right answer out of it? And to really paraphrase, the way that most other people are approaching that is just building massively redundant things, which will become very difficult as you need to cool all of that down to near absolute zero and maintain coherence across all of it. Without going into the details of a special sauce, there is a unique approach that is being taken by Yale and by QCI to solve that. And that is a known thing that is going to be a big bottleneck that, in our belief, there's a unique and valuable thing being done here to solve.
So a question for Brandon. In the world of investing, there's the concept of smart money and dumb money. And venture capitalists often provide technology to the entrepreneurs they invest in. I would imagine that's a deep challenge to provide technology to the Quantum Institute. So could you describe how you provide value in investing in the Institute?
Yes, and I'm hoping that I can pre-assume that you were implying that we were smart money with that. Cool. That'll color my answer one way or the other. So venture, I mean, we all, at the end of the day, right, everybody's money is as green as the next guy's money. And so we're all trying, and we all try very much to provide value above and beyond the dollars that we give. For any high quality entrepreneur, there's lots of people that are going to want to try to fund that company. And so you have to provide something that's differentiated. However, that said, it's actually often not technology that we offer. At the end of the day, I am no help to Rob, and nor is anyone at Canaan when it comes to physics and the waveform. That's not what we value. What we do provide value with, I hope, and what we try is around company building and thinking through strategic questions. And that sounds a little bit big and vague, but specifically, helping thinking about hiring, helping bringing people in to potentially hire, to help build the team, to help talk through, hey, this person is a very interesting candidate, but they're expensive vis-a-vis what we had budgeted. How do we think about that? What do we do? How do we think about how we interact? We're getting a lot of press. How do we think about interacting with very large incumbents that all of a sudden are knocking on our door and want to come by and spend lots of time with us? Is that something, should we spend time doing that? Should we not? So all of those things. I mean, I think we talk multiple times a week.
Yep.
And so, that's where we try to provide value. And then also just with connections to people that may not be able to connect with. So we have a deep team in life sciences. It will be very easy when the time is right to connect QCI with all of the chemistry and biopharma companies who are the most logical first buyer of a device.
Right. And as I mentioned, we need a lot of, we need to find extraordinary people in some of the conventional disciplines to bring onto our team. And so, between Canaan and Sequoia, we have the East and the West Coast, very deep networks of connections they have, and that's been really useful. Yeah.
Back? Yeah.
You mentioned needing to develop training your people. What is your specific training strategy? Do you have in-house mentorships, or what have you found to be effective?
I guess you're asking training at the company.
So I mean,
don't know yet.
Yeah, how many employees are
we're at
right
9 or 10 full-time employees right now. Yeah.
Sort of answer is probably not there yet, but that is that's another thing as the company scales, that will be addressed.
Right.
And we have people that you can talk to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, on the university side, we have, I think one of the things that's unique about Yale here and in quantum and especially, is we've built a very collaborative network of professors. It's not just my research lab. There's 5, 6 research groups and more that really interact on a daily basis. And now the field has advanced enough that bringing in a new graduate student and getting them up to speed is something that there's a lot to learn. And it's done somewhat organically by having a collaborative team and discussions and meetings amongst them. And so something that's interesting was people would ask me, what do you want the corporate culture at QCI to be? And I said, ooh, good question. I have no idea. What is a corporate culture? And then at one point I was describing to somebody how I interviewed students and postdocs and how we got them up to speed when they came to Yale. And they're like, oh yeah, that's your corporate culture. So I think to some extent, having the right people, the right mindset so that everyone is curious, everyone is asking questions and communicating across. I had an opportunity to visit SpaceX and get a tour there and meet some of the engineers there. And I would have thought at that scale that there was definitely like a whole curriculum they would have, always. That was how they did it. Now, whether we can manage that big difference between 10 people and the scale of SpaceX. But
I've got a question regarding the industries that you're working with. Which industries are you talking to about quantum computing? Who's coming to you with use cases or areas that they want to explore with you?
Yeah, so thinking quantum computing, we have several examples of algorithms or use cases that are uniquely empowered by quantum. They include sort of, mostly scientific questions, so, quantum simulations of new materials, new molecules, things like that. There's also problems in optimization, which can be applied in a lot of different disciplines from engineering to financial sectors. And then, there's also a lot of interest in quantum-enabled machine learning and things. And so all that could do potentially for AI. So we have, there's a lot of interest in the space. I think it's kind of early stages. And, we definitely need to learn more about what would it take to be useful for those disciplines. And, we're looking for people in some of those areas who will be early adopters and want to sort of both teach us how we can optimize the hardware and software that QCI builds for their problems, and then also, get them up to speed on these things. We can't just build the machine and hope that people will beat a path to the door. And we also can't say, okay, we built it, now how do you program it? So that's not the case. There's actually a lot that's already known about the quantum computer science, but we still do need to bridge from the early stage machines that we're able to build today to, the real use cases.
Rob, you forgot to mention the Bitcoin mining.
The Bitcoin mining was going to come up, but thank you, Brendan. Yeah, we have to have a board meeting and talk about that. Okay,
Yeah, there's a question back there.
I'm wondering if you can comment on the materials used to construct the machines?
Yeah, so our particular approach uses superconducting electronic devices. So one of the things that our team at Yale has won a lot of scientific accolades for is figuring out how to make novel integrated circuits using these superconducting electrical devices to be the quantum bits, to act as an individual atom, and then to be programmable just by sitting at a keyboard interface and sending in some electrical signals into this refrigerator. So the materials used are pretty banal. It's silicon or sapphire substrates and aluminum or indium. There's a few metals which are perfectly good superconductors. So there aren't really exotic materials inside. What we also have found, though, over the years is to get the best performance out of these devices, you care about very subtle effects. We use ultra-pure materials. There's a lot of new physics and material science that could go into further improving quantum technologies. It's just not sort of within the scope of what a lot of people call novel materials and things these days.
I have a little bit of a different question. It's for both of you. At any point have you felt that you would have to choose between your academic career and running the company as a professor? And then have you thought about it for the venture side of having him choose or forcing that choice?
So I'll answer this. So we've invested in a number of companies that have specifically come out of Yale and come out of academia, right? And those companies take a number of different routes, right? Sometimes people go run the company, and a lot of times people stay on as chief scientists while they do their normal day job at their academic institution. So I am we are totally indifferent. What's really important to me and to Kanan is that that QCI maintains its tight relationship with Yale and the Yale Quantum Institute. That's a hugely valuable asset to the company and very unlike what any other company has. And so no, there's no like pressure.
Right. Cool. And from my side, from my side, what we could see is that, although other people were getting into this and throwing resources at it, they weren't doing it intelligently. They weren't doing it the right way. A lot of what we see IBM and Google doing is they're sort of trying to brute force engineer the things we were doing in the Yale labs 10 years ago. So there's an opportunity here to be much smarter. And also, as a scientist and as a professor, there's an opportunity here. And I had a choice, right? So we could sit on the sidelines and see if it all works, or we could take an active role. And so, let's give it a try. So definitely in the early stage of the company, too, we have to build facilities. Somebody's got to articulate the vision. I've got to find and recruit the team, and then set in place the technological development. Now, it also means when the company's two people that somebody's got to sign off and negotiate the contracts. I'm totally ready to give that part up whenever we have someone who can do that for us. So.
You talk about billions being invested, developing hardware, developing programming. It's still early stage, but can you give us a sense of the timeline? Is this 5 years away, 10 years away, 20 years off? When are the venture capitalists going to get paid off? So what's the timeline here for practical applications?
It's a long timeline compared to many things, right? And so that was one of the things. No, but one of the things I had to learn was going out and finding, not all venture firms are created equal, right? So some people want to see, viability in the marketplace in 18 months. That's not what quantum computing is about yet. That's not what we wanted to do, right? So, you will see a lot of things out in the popular press. In a funny way, a lot of the big players in the space are very pro quantum computing, but they're still saying it's a decade away. So I think it's both a little harder than they say it's going to be, but we'll probably get there a little sooner. So, I think a real challenge for the field, though, is finding those first actual use cases. So what is the minimum size of a system? What is the easiest to build quantum computer that will actually demonstrate some real value? And that's
the first use that you were trying to
wait and see.
So I'll just answer your question in a different way, which is, the specific timeline I think is unclear. I think there will undoubtedly be progress that will create a valuable company within the lifetime of my venture capital fund. That's how I think about it. There are enough gates that we have lined up that are undoubtedly value-producing events. Whether or not there's a device that you're using for some computation that you need to do in your day job in the next 4 or 5 years is a different question.
We're not trying to build another device or a new app. It's a whole new industry that's we're in the process of launching. So that's going to take a little longer.
I read the news one or 2 months ago. It says Google says it's close to achieving quantum supremacy. I want to know what's the meaning of this achievement, and I also want to know is there like an absolute measurement to compare to different quantum computers?
Yep. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So the question is, what really does quantum supremacy mean? And also, I think sort of implicit in that is, what is a benchmark of success? How do you compare a quantum computer and a regular computer, right? And so, in the end, the comparison that matters is, can I use my quantum computer to do something useful for you or someone in the audience here that we couldn't have done otherwise, okay? And now, in the conventional approaches that most people are following, you need to have hundreds or maybe even thousands or tens of thousands of physical elements, physically working qubits at a very high performance to give one bit of useful information in the computation. So what Google and the others are trying to do is get to sort of the scale of 30 or 50 physical bits or elements, which I think is a hard engineering problem, but will eventually be doable. But then in that approach, you've only got sort of one bit of useful compute. So there will be a lot more stages of development needed to get to a useful computer. Something we've been following here at Yale and we're employing at QCI is something known as the modular approach to quantum computing. So we're building sort of small functional quantum units that we can then network and connect together into a larger computer. I think that's a much smarter approach for the scaling overall. So, but it's a bit hard to compare these things. Obviously, everyone knows about regular transistors and Moore's law. It's really easy to say, success in computing is putting more widgets on a die. But it's not clear that that's really going to be the right metric for progress in quantum computing.
Are you at all concerned sort of with the Robert Oppenheimer paradigm, with cyber warfare? I mean, security at all? I mean, when this genie is let out of the bottle, I mean, it's going to change. When you talk about first uses, there are white uses and black uses.
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so I think, for those of you who may not know, I mean, the original killer app, as it were, for quantum is factorization of a large number into its component primes, which would allow one to break most of modern cryptography. And so that's one reason why the government has been investing in this area for many decades. They needed to know if a quantum computer could be built. So a few years ago, the NSA already announced that they were scared enough that they thought the onset of useful quantum computers was close enough time horizon for them that they would move to post-quantum cryptography schemes. There are cryptography schemes that would not be breakable by a quantum computer. So we're not really worried about that. I don't think a lot of people really see cryptography as a big market space. I think there's also an interesting flip side of this, right, which is one of the things that's special and unique about quantum information is that it cannot be copied. So there are actually schemes for using quantum information to do secure communication or to ensure privacy for people. And so I'm not so worried about the Oppenheimer thing. But
okay, we have time for one more question, and we have to look over here.
Yes, could you comment about the conflict between preserving intellectual property and academia and publishing and collaborating with other people, and how you balance that?
yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a conflict, actually, right? So, what we do at the university is we develop new ideas, and those are published and disseminated in papers, in theses, and the like. And as in many disciplines, it's now routine for us to, before we go public with a result, I mean, there was always a stage where I would vet it internally and ask really hard questions to make sure that the results were robust and not somehow wrong, okay? And now part of that is also including, like, is this a useful invention and something which is patentable? And then we have now a nice framework where that's something which is possible. So, I don't think there's an inherent conflict. That's what the university is about, is innovating and trying to create new knowledge, which should be helpful, and that's part of Yale's role, is to make the world a better place through this kind of generation of knowledge. Now there's just a pathway for actually getting that into the real world.
I've got dispensation to do one more question.
Can you provide insight into the human-machine interface in terms of compilers, standards, any types of, are we in our infancy, or can we use quantum computing to optimize communicating with the device?
How do we communicate with our quantum hardware? Is that the question? Yeah. So it turns out there's a fairly well-developed theory of quantum programming. We know if you have these quantum bits, there are certain functions you need to be able to enact on them. They're the analog of the NOTs and AND gates of Boolean logic in a conventional computer. What we've already had to develop just in the course of the research in order to develop the quantum bits and to demonstrate the first algorithms, which were done in our lab in 2008, 2009, we had to develop a conventional programming interface. So, essentially you would use this computer like it was a special purpose piece of hardware. You can program an algorithm, you can discover those. There needs to be a compiler. It needs to translate, however, all the way down into sort of very unusual analog signals at power levels that are 9 or 10 orders of magnitude lower than in a conventional computer, and so there's a lot of exotic aspects of that. But in the end, it's just something that you can call up, and you can program in a kind of a conventional way. So that's all quantum computers will have this kind of conventional computing interface, in part because computers and software are how you manage and build complex machines, right?
Okay, I think we have to stop there, but it's been great. It's a lot of fun.
All right.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job. Thanks.
Thanks.
And then,
Thank you. Yeah.